I start, I would just like to acknowledge that those of us who are in Canberra are meeting on Ngunnawal land, and to acknowledge elders past and present and emerging, and also to acknowledge the traditional owners of Indigenous land where else anyone else is participating in this seminar. I'd also like to say good morning to any of our colleagues and friends who might be joining us from Melbourne, who are currently in lockdown. So this morning, I want to cover a few points around the role of values in policy and politics. Many of these ideas are described in the book, The Interrogating Public Policy Theory, a Political Values Perspective, which came out last year and which John Dryzek kindly launched for us at a function of the Academy of the Social Sciences last year. Basically, I want to talk about how important values are in our understanding of policy and politics. This has been recognised by many writers in the past, but they've not put it front and centre of their analysis. And my argument today is that actually thinking about policy and politics in values terms actually is a very useful way of understanding them. So Charles Lindblom actually used the word values 74 times in his famous article, The Science of Muddling Through. And he actually argued that one of the virtues of incrementalism was that it allowed values that had been overlooked in earlier iterations of policy to be revisited when that policy was revised. And he saw the role of watchdogs in that process as being the protectors of particular values in the policy process. Lasswell, of course, had values at the basis of his vision for policy sciences. His objectives were around human dignity and democracy. Simon talked about both values premises and factual premises in the decision environment when he was talking about bounded rationality. Deborah Stone wrote about the roles of values in the social construction of problems and their solutions. And Rattel and Weber, in their famous piece on wicked problems, pointed out the fact that wicked problems were wicked problems because they involved values, and that there were values decisions to be made at the basis of policy choice. But beyond these references in these works, values have never been put front and centre. And I wonder whether perhaps part of the reason this hasn't happened theoretically is because of confusion about what values actually are, what do we mean by the term values, and also for researchers whether they can be measured empirically. If you look at the literature around values, there's a whole range of different definitions. There's confusion as to the difference between values and attitudes and ideas and behaviours and so on. So I think that's probably been part of the obstacle. The first major empirical research that was done into values was undertaken by Milton Rokeach in the late 60s and published in 1973 in a very large volume on human values. Rokeach identified 18 terminal and 18 instrumental values. And of interest to political scientists, he then mapped political values on a two-dimensional grid, which had freedom on one axis and equality on the other. Now, his placement of the various major ideologies of the time on that 2x2 grid was done on the basis of the analysis of a limited number of what he saw as the key writings in fascism, liberalism, capitalism, and communism. And he just did a literature review and identified the characteristics and then placed these four ideologies on the 2x2 grid. Inglehart, of course, came up with the idea of post-materialist values, where he identified values for the post-war generation who were less concerned about the simple needs of survival and were becoming more concerned with things like environmentalism, women's rights, and so on. And he saw this as a generational shift in politics. And then finally, the other major contribution to our empirical understanding of values comes from Shalom Schwartz. And I'm going to be coming back to Schwartz's ideas because I think they're the area that has the most potential for us as political scientists and public policy scholars to understand the role of values. All of these ideas are discussed in the book, which also critiques some of the more popular theories in policy studies. When reviewing the book last year, John suggested we'd killed them all off, and generally finds them wanting, because in our assessment, the reason that these various theories are flawed. First of all, several of them, it's actually questionable whether they are theories and not metaphors, but also because they largely ignore democratic politics, and in our view, they ignore the values dimension of the policy process. So we argue that that is a major gap in those approaches to understanding policy. So to start with, I'll start with Schwartz's definition from his first work done with his colleague Wolfgang Bilski, where he argued that values are concepts or beliefs about desirable end states or behaviours that transcend specific situations, guide selection or evaluation of behaviour and events, and are ordered by relative importance. Schwartz was asked as a young academic in the early 1970s to review Rokeach's book. And when he did, he came to the conclusion that, well, he theorised that there must be a relationship between values. So values didn't just exist in isolation, but perhaps there was some sort of relationship with them. And he developed a theory that values were organised on a circular continuum, and that there was a relationship between values, and that the differences between individuals were not in terms of one holding one value and one holding another, but the difference was in the way people prioritised a common set of values. So he theorised and developed a model which has now been tested in over 80 countries with tens of thousands of people. And I'm going to come to his model in a moment. But his work hasn't been used extensively by political scientists except for a couple of voting studies. So in political terms then, what do we mean? How does Schwartz's work translate? Well, our view of this is that society is made up of individuals whose lives are guided by a small number of deeply held values that inform their behaviour and attitudes. And these values are both personal and societally based. So the priority that's given to different values and the strength with which they are held is actually specific to the individual and results in differences in policy preferences and political attitudes. So we all generally share the same sorts of values, and Schwartz has proved this empirically, but it's the way in which we prioritise those values that distinguishes one from the other. And these values priorities are set very early in life. And in fact, work being done by the Centre for Human and Cultural Values at University of Western Australia has actually identified values priorities in children as young as 4 and 5, where their values priorities are beginning to become quite set. So what I want to do today is illustrate this idea that values are an important part of policy and politics by reference to Powell's idea of the chain of democratic responsiveness, and how values are implicated at every step along the way, from the values choices and the political attitudes of the voter right through to the policy choices that are made at the end of the process. So to start with, this is Schwartz's theory. This is his wheel of values. Now, you can see that there are 4 higher level values: conservation, self-enhancement, self-transcendence, and openness to change. These are overlaid over 10 lower order values, and then these can actually be broken up further and further. And the more they're broken up, the relationship between them remains consistent. As I said, these have been tested in over 80 countries with tens of thousands of respondents, and the relationship between the values is important. Values priorities matter. And the findings of this and a large body of related research confirm this theory that individuals have a shared value structure, but different priorities, which are then activated in different choice situations. Few people have extreme positions on particular values, but they have preferences in terms of priorities. So individuals disagree on the weight that's given to one value over another. And for example, in the case of attitudes towards refugees, individuals who perhaps are stronger on self-transcendent values such as universalism are more likely to favour open borders and more humanitarian responses to refugees than people who sit over in the conservation quadrant of Schwartz's model and are more concerned about security. So we don't, in a refugee situation, there's very few people in the community who are either bleeding heart liberals at one end who'll let anybody in without any concerns, or hard-hearted people at the other end who want to shoot refugees at the border. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, but with a preference one way or the other because of our personal values, priorities. And of course, the challenge for government then becomes that governments in a democratic system are representing all of the people in the community with all of their values priorities. And they need to be weighing and juggling these values when they are arriving at policy decisions that they, of course, will hope will be popular in the electorate. So I'm going to just give you some thoughts around how this might connect to Powell's chain of democratic responsiveness. I apologise that this isn't an ideal representation of it. This is from the journal article. I'll be providing the details of the references at the end. Now, my argument today is that values actually provide a connecting thread running through all of these various stages of the chain of responsiveness. So in the first instance, citizens' preferences are determined by their values. And there's work in political psychology that shows that people's political choices and their voting choices are anchored in their values. Values cues are a really important decision heuristic for voters. That means that they don't have to go through every policy manifesto line by line to see for whom they should vote. They see political parties in values terms as groups that represent particular priorities, whether it be individualism over collectivism, for example, will determine whether they're going to vote more to the right or to the left. So we've got evidence from political psychology that this is the case, that values are one of the decision heuristics that people use. So when citizens are making their choice, they are making their choice through electoral systems which have been socially constructed. And electoral systems embody particular values choices. As historical institutionalism tells us, institutions are often the embodiments of values choices or values decisions made at a particular point in time. So plurality systems of voting appeal more to people who are on the conservation side of Schwartz's circle because they are more likely to deliver stability and cohesion in a plurality election. Whereas proportional electoral systems are more likely to deliver diversity, which is going to appeal to people for whom openness to change and self-transcendence values align more closely with their personal values. So even the electoral system itself has values embedded in it, in the choices that have been made in the design of those electoral systems to prioritise some values over others. So that takes us through to policymaking, which is where the policy choice is made. This is clearly values-based, and Deborah Stone argues this very, very nicely about the way what we choose as a policy problem is in and of itself a values decision. There's choices made that are values-based in, first of all, in the construction of target populations, as Schneider and Ingram put it. So who is worthy of our support? Who are we more likely to look favourably on is a values-based choice. The types of policy instruments that we consider are also values-based. So all policy questions are about juggling conflicting societal values. And we use the term juggling in the book very deliberately because often people talk about balancing values. But the problem with the term balancing is it implies that there's a point of equilibrium at which the policy solution is correct. The metaphor of juggling, I think, is much more accurate because it's a system that is constantly in motion, where it's possible to drop one object and pick another one up, where the objects may be of different weights and different volumes, and the system keeps moving. And I think this is consistent with Lindblom's idea of incremental policy making being about the revisiting of values that have been overlooked in earlier iterations of policy. So there are clear value trade-offs involved in a policy choice. A good example is the very well-known one in Australia of the Murray-Darling Basin. People writing policy for the Murray-Darling Basin are juggling conflicting, at times, values. They're juggling environmental, social, and economic values. And they need to get these right. And as we've seen over the last decade, we still aren't at a position where people feel that that values balance is right. And to go back to our critique, or as John put it, killing off of public policy theory, existing public policy theory largely ignores this completely or only mentions it in passing, with the exception of Deborah Stone. So what are the implications for policy of these ideas? Well, first of all, I think this indicates that there are limits on expectations of evidence-based policy making. I think the first thing that gets overlooked when we talk about evidence-based policy making is that evidence itself is value-laden. So the choices that researchers make when they are designing research questions are value-laden. People choose to research, for example, river red gums because they think river red gums are important and that they are worthy of research. So choices are made in the research questions that we explore. I research policy because I think policy is important. It aligns with my values that we should be having a better way of understanding policy and of doing policy. So the evidence that's presented into evidence-based policy making isn't neutral and isn't value-free. This then leads to the uncomfortable conclusion that policy making is actually a political activity. In my view, yes, it is, and it should be, because in a sense, policy making is the business end of the political process. We elect our politicians to do stuff. We elect them to implement a vision of the good society on our behalf, and policy is the way that they do that. So this returns us to the idea of bounded rationality, and Simon's idea that the bounds around rational policymaking include values premises. So if you're making policy for a Liberal government in Australia and you're looking at coming up with a solution around industrial relations, you are not going to go to them and suggest that trade unions should be given more power or a louder voice. Similarly, you wouldn't tell a Labor government you should abolish trade unions. There are bounds that are put around the policy-making process by the values of the party in government, by the values of the organisation that you work in. And Simon recognised this in his ideas around bounded rationality. So policy will always be political. So what else does this idea of using Schwartz perhaps in a policy context mean? Well, earlier this year with some colleagues, we undertook some survey work around COVID. We did some surveys in the early stages of the pandemic with a large panel of participants through the University of Western Australia, and they were participants on a panel for whom we had all of the Schwartz information and their values priority. And we asked them some questions around their attitudes towards COVID-19, towards the epidemic, including their attitudes towards government responses and towards the restrictions that were being imposed on people's lives at the time. We also asked them about where they got their information from the media and who they trusted. We're only in the preliminary stages of analysing those data, but one of the really strong things that's come through is that values matter. So the values preferences of the respondents to our survey clearly started aligning with particular responses to questions around the government's response, around the restrictions and around their attitudes towards COVID. So, for example, people who were much stronger on benevolence and universalism were much more open to complying with the kinds of restrictions that governments wanted to impose on them than people who were much more in the individualistic side of the Schwartz circle. Now, this is really important for policymakers because it has clear implications for government messaging. If you're going to use nudge strategies or other ways of trying to persuade people to comply with particular policy approaches, it's really important to understand where they're coming from in values terms. And we've done some preliminary work around changing the messaging to see how different messages appeal to people with different values priorities. Again, we're in the early stages of analysing these data, but there do seem to be values responses to the way you frame government messages and from whom the message comes as well. So this is really important for government, and I think it's going to become increasingly important as this epidemic progresses, because people are going to start getting fatigued. I know I'm getting fatigued. And it's going to be really important that government has an effective way of communicating with all its citizens to get them to continue to comply as far as possible with the social restrictions that we're living with. And one way to do this would be to think about how that messaging can be fine-tuned for people who have different values priorities. And this more generally, beyond the COVID example, has implications for nudge strategies more generally, that different types of people are going to respond to different values messaging. So what does this mean for researchers? Well, I think there's a lot of scope to connect Schwartz's work with political science and policy studies. Hasn't been a lot of it done. There's been some done at the fringes of political psychology. There's been a couple of small surveys done around voting patterns in Italy and in Israel, but there has not been a major push to incorporate Schwartz's work with political science and policy studies. I think there's a really big potential for that to happen, particularly we've had recognition in our own literature for over half a century that values are an important part of understanding the policy process. But up until now, we haven't really had this strong basis for a common understanding of what we mean about values. And we've now got a theoretical model that's been extensively tested empirically with lots of data that we can draw on that allow us to start developing a common understanding of what we mean by the term values, but also provides us with a model that we can use to have a common basis to any research that we do that brings values into our research question. So we've got both theoretical and empirical insights from Schwartz that I think are really amenable to application to political science and policy studies. We also have the basis for some fantastic comparative work. The European Social Survey, which has been going for a number of years now, is based in Schwartz's theory. And there's a massive database of studies that have been done that are accessible to researchers to draw on to research a whole range of questions. There's been a large number of PhDs undertaken using Schwartz's work, but again, still I don't think it's been tapped into adequately by people in political science and policy studies. So given my conclusion, or our conclusions in our book, that theory in policy studies is not working particularly well, and partly because everyone thinks they've got a grand theory, I would like to emphasise I am not proposing a grand theory of policy studies. What I am suggesting is that values might provide us with a useful additional lens through which to consider our disciplines and our research questions, and provides us a tool that we can use for some empirical testing of some of our theoretical ideas. I've got some references there. We can make those available, and I'm happy to take questions.